Support for Trifles comes from the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And by listeners like you, who choose to support us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the colorman was retired, the three-quarter was missing, and the client was illustrious, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever wondered why Sherlock Holmes had 3 different colored dressing gowns? Or what a Crockford is?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 301, Clients in Jeopardy. Well, hello there, and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast, where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, do you find yourself in Jeopardy today?
No, but actually I'm in Password. And the problem is that my partner, is giving me all sorts of bizarre clues about broken glassware, and I can't figure it out.
Well, it's crystal clear to me. Maybe we should try our hand at a game show together. As something aside from canonical couplets over in I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Oh, I've always wanted to do a Sherlockian version of Just a Minute, that British show where you have to speak for 60 seconds without hesitation, deviation, or
Pauses?
No, hesitation, deviation, or something else. There's some other thing you're not supposed to speak at. Speak continuously, and it's a wonderful show. It's going on since 1963, I think.
I don't know if you have it in you, Bert, to speak longer than 60 seconds at any given moment about any given topic. You have yet to be tested in that area.
Somehow I believe that I could probably manage to do it.
Well,
repetition. Hesitation, repetition, or deviation from the
okay.
subject.
Well, you can say that again.
Yep.
Well, for those of you who are not attuned yet, not to the distant view, hello, but to our show, you can find the show notes for this episode at ihose.co/trifles301. That'll direct you to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com site, specifically to this episode. Anything we mention in terms of links or previous episodes, or even our Patreon button. Those are all included in the show notes there. I do mention Patreon because it is available for folks who would like to listen to the show without the advertisements. We usually have an ad about halfway through our episode. If you don't like that interruption, there's a way around it. For as little as $1 a month, you can support the show on Patreon. Your support helps us to mine for new material, to do our research, and to come up with prizes from time to time that we send out. So we are now into October. This is season 6, and we're actively planning for season 7. We're actually going to put up a post on Patreon, specific to our Patreon supporters, asking you about your input for next season. If there are things that you have always wondered about, if there are things that you think we need to discuss to help the Sherlockian world understand more about what's going on in the Sherlock Holmes stories, please let us know there. You'll see it in a post in your Patreon feed there. And again, if you'd like to go directly to our Patreon, it is patreon.com/trifles. Simple as that, patreon.com/trifles. And of course, if you want to email us, it's just trifles@ihearofsherlock.com in an email. Well, the first episode of every month in Season 6 is something to do with a piece of old Sherlockian scholarship. We call this series Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist, because as we know, Sherlockians like to develop theories about things. And in this case, we're turning to a publication called The Second Cab. This is put out by the Speckled Band of Boston, published by Stoke Moran, Boston, in 1947. The Second Cab is 15 Sherlockian essays, 1 sonnet, and a quiz. And Bert, just as an aside, do you know where The Second Cab comes from as a suggestion for a publication title?
Well, it comes from Holmes's comment and instruction to Dr. Watson at one point in the canon where he says to him, don't take the first cab, don't take the second cab, take the third cab. And however, that's not directly relevant, I suppose, to the second cab.
Yeah, I don't know why we're taking the second cab. The first time I came across any publication from the Speckled Band of Boston, which is that's where this is from, that group that was founded in 1940 in Boston, outside of the Baker Street Irregulars in New York. I think the first version I found was the fifth cab, and I began diving back down. I got a copy of the fourth cab, then the third cab, and finally I came across a copy of the second cab. I've never been able to find the Speckled Band's publication of the first cab. Have you?
Well, no, there wasn't one. The first cab they considered the first cab to be 221B. The one of the books that was published,
the Vincent Starrett publication.
Yeah, earlier in the 40s. That was sort of intellectually, I think, the first cab, and then they decided. And that's a good point, because those books that came out in the early 40s, and we've spoken elsewhere about, the trilogy Dinner and 221B and all sorts of things. But those early publications sort of kicked off the idea, wait a minute, why don't we're a established science society. We've been doing papers. We've been having conversations. We've been presenting things. Why don't we put some of those things together in a volume? And that led in 1947 to printing 300 copies of The Second Cab, which, as you describe, 15 Sherlockian essays, a sonnet, and a quiz, edited by James Keddy Jr.
And the point there that this is, these are one of 300 copies. You've got a copy. I've got a copy. My copy is number 25. Yours is signed by a number of the authors.
Yeah, my copy's number 220.
220 out of 300. You missed it by
almost
one.
Had
Bert.
221.
I know, missed it by one. But the point here is that these are essays. These are pieces of Sherlockian scholarship that may not have been seen by folks because of their relative scarcity. So we thought we would take this as an opportunity to look into some of them. And the one we're talking about in this episode is called Clients in Jeopardy. And it's written by Henry C. Clark. And Henry C. Clark was a member of the Speckled Band, and really the only relevant information we have about Henry C. Clark is that he was secretary of the Harvard Alumni Association, and I think he was treasurer at one point as well. So that was his professional life was involved with Harvard. He also had a farm up in the North Shore. But the point here is that he wrote about this issue where Holmes, in a number of instances, finds himself beseeched by clients who are in danger in some way. And in some cases, Holmes doesn't really do much to help them avoid the danger that is threatening them, does he?
No, not at all. And that's one of the interesting things about Henry Clark's paper here, because he reviews some instances, to which we will add a couple, of Holmes' apparent disregard for the safety of his clients. But I think, too, one of the interesting things we want to get to is how Henry Clark left this paper, how he ended this paper, because I think there are things that we want to talk about. But no, this comes, along from time to time. And Clark begins by saying, there are at least 4 of the most famous Holmes cases where a singular lack of care for the safety of his clients deserves the closest examination and maybe criticism. And he goes right to a great example here in The Copper Beeches, the great story about Violet Hunter, who's all alone in the world, where Henry Clark says, the client was placed in a position of great danger, which could have been avoided at the outset. And then, so why don't we stop there for a minute, and then before we get on to the other two, Clark says maybe Holmes can't be blamed too strongly in The Copper Beeches, yet a little insistence on his part might have prevented Miss Hunter from accepting the position.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, let's think about The Copper Beeches for a moment. And I know this is a story with which you have great familiarity, Bert, being an active member of the Sons of the Copper Beeches in Philadelphia. This is kind of your signature story for that Sherlockian society. What did Holmes actually do in The Copper Beeches? I mean, here Violet Hunter comes to him and says, I've got this opportunity, and he doesn't dissuade her from taking the job. As a matter of fact, her mind gets made up specifically to take the job. And Holmes had previously come into contact with a criminal who was willing to pay more than twice, or on average twice as much as the prevailing wages would have dictated in the Red-Headed League. Excuse me, that was half wages. Someone was willing to come at half pay to join Jabez Wilson because he wanted access to the cellar. In this case, we've got Jeffro Rucastle, who is looking to hire Violet Hunter at twice what a normal governess would be paid. So right there, you would think that the bells would have gone off in Holmes's mind, and he would have said, well, wait a minute. Let's examine this a little more thoroughly together before we actually send you down to Winchester.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's one of the great things about this paper, because the subtext here is, what can we learn about Holmes's character? What's going on here? In The Copper Beeches, he begins, Watson tells us, really by being in sort of a dark mood. He feels that he's just become maybe irrelevant. There are people calling him now to investigate all sorts of peculiar little things, like lost lead pencils. And now this woman wants to come and see me, whoever this is, to find out whether or not she should take a job. I mean, is this what I've sunk to? So he's in sort of a bad mood when Copper Beeches begins, but he's immediately impressed, as is Watson, by Violet Hunter. Her bearing, her approach, the clear way she states the problem and her condition, her overall aspect. He really sits up, and more than sits up and pays attention and admires her. He also expresses later on in the case one of his rare familial feelings. After she's gone, he says to Watson, "It's not a position I would like a sister of mine to have taken." So clearly there's something here that's penetrated into Holmes' character and rung a gong. There's some resonance here and some attraction and response. And yet, off she goes into the unknown.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's two things that I'm sparked with from that remark, Bert. One is that Holmes typically relied upon data, facts, information, and he had nothing more than his gut instinct at this point. So as the true analytical reasoner that he was staying true to himself. He didn't say, hey, I've got a bad feeling about this, you better steer clear. He let her go. probably because he wanted to collect more data, right? And when they met up again at the public house, and she brought the hair that she found, well, that's a piece of data. The second thing is that when Holmes says that he wouldn't want his any sister of his to be placed in that kind of a situation, a number of scholars have taken this to indicate that Sherlock Holmes had a sister. Well, I would argue that it's probably quite the opposite, that if he did have a sister, he would have been even more careful about allowing Miss Hunter to go off on her own. He was just supposing that if he had a sister, this is how he might act.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great observation, and I like that negative, that the corollary you've come up with there that says, I think this is proof that maybe he didn't have a sister, that he was just sort of thinking about that. But Clark tells us, just sort of to close this out, as it was, speaking about Violet Hunter here, she left Holmes's flat with merely the promise that a wire would bring him to her aid. And that's what happens. Holmes says, well, you've only need to send me a note and I'll leap to your aid. But, says Clark, how was Holmes to tell that having entered this perhaps sinister household, she would be able to escape to send a telegram?
That's a great point.
Yeah.
That's a really great point. Yeah, if she does, it's not like she can pick up her cell phone and text him. She would have had to get a message off to a telegraph office or travel to a telegraph office herself.
Yes.
So, interesting conundrum. Well, as we continue to consider clients in jeopardy, think about this for just a moment.
Yes, we're in the middle of one of those Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist episodes of Trifles, where we're looking at a classic piece of Sherlockian scholarship. Well, where can you find classic Sherlockian scholarship? Well, there are a couple of places, and we can think of one of them right off the bat that's available right now. It's The Grand Game, Volume 2, which contains Sherlockian scholarship from a variety of sources, mostly the Baker Street Journal, from 1960 to 2010. Volume 2 is all that's left because Volume 1 was so popular, it sold out. We'll have more news on bringing Volume 1 back from the dead in future episodes, but for now, get on over to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and pick up your copy of Volume 2 of The Grand Game, covering the last half-century of Sherlockian scholarship. You won't find better work in a single volume anywhere else. Go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and get The Grand Game Volume 2 today.
Okay, we're back talking about Holmes' neglect with respect to some of his clients. I think the next two are fairly easy to pick off. In The Greek Interpreter, right, we have Mr. Melas, who meets with Holmes and his brother Mycroft and Watson at the Diogenes Club and shares his strange tale of being abducted and asked to act in, well, what his job is as an interpreter at the Myrtles, where someone is being held against his will. Now, in this case, he's already been kidnapped. He's already been taken somewhere against his will and without his knowledge. So it should be very clear that there is danger afoot here. And Clark writes, after Melas had told his story, he was merely dismissed with the advice that he should be on his guard, as the abductors must know of his betrayal of them. No suggestion of furnishing him with a bodyguard was made, despite the fact that Holmes realized fully Melas would be easy prey. And as Holmes later remarked to Watson after Melas's disappearance, he's a man of no personal courage, as they are well aware from their experience the other night. So you let this guy go out after he's betrayed his captors, and you admit that he's got no physical attributes that would allow him to defend himself. And you're surprised he gets abducted again?
Well, and it's a double failure, because in that particular case, Mycroft then places an advertisement which puts Mr. Melas in more jeopardy.
Right.
You would think someone would say to him, you might need a bodyguard, or do you have a pistol, or what can you do in terms of self-protection? But no, they, having been kidnapped and gone to the scene of a kidnapping and alerted his abductors, Melas is sadly left, to his own devices.
And, to me, that indicates, is there some kind of hereditary strain of sociopathy in the Holmes family, that each brother really didn't care about the life of this gentleman? They just wanted to solve the problem at hand.
Yes.
It's amazing.
Mycroft, I'm afraid that one of the groundskeepers has fallen in the well again. Have we given any thought to covering that up? Oh, no. We have plenty of groundskeepers, sure.
Oh, yeah. What else to do on Saturdays but conduct autopsies of our gardeners?
Dear.
And then the other one is the 5 orange pips. And this is probably one of the most famous, where, John Openshaw called at Baker Street in this dark and stormy night, prototypical, and very clearly laid out the threatening messages that his uncle was receiving. And lo and behold, he goes on his way and ultimately dies after, they find him face down in a puddle by Waterloo Bridge, but you can pretty much infer what happened from that.
Yes, and Clark tells us at least Holmes had the grace to acknowledge his failure. My goodness. Nowhere else can one recall such a confession of humiliation as Holmes replied, "That hurts my pride, Watson." I mean, he's not concerned about the poor fellow dying.
Right.
It hurts my pride. Now it's personal. It becomes a personal matter. And if I have the health, I will set my hand on this gang. Oh, that he should come to me for help, and that I should send him away to his death. Well, this does seem to happen fairly frequently. We should have a new scion called the Expendable Clients of Sherlock Holmes.
I don't know if I'd want to go to their meetings. You got to be careful on your way home, that's for sure.
Yeah, the meeting in an elevator shaft. Well, and then we have Sir Henry Baskerville in, The Hound of the Baskervilles. Well, he goes into this sort of strange situation. Sir Charles has already been murdered. There's a mysterious hound. Watson is his only bodyguard. Sir Henry's never told to carry a weapon. He's sent on a dreadful walk home from Stapleton's unarmed. And then, oh my goodness, the whole prospect of being able to deal with the hound on the moor, was very chancy. And in particular, Holmes in previous cases doesn't appear to be very skilled with a revolver. And, so clearly Sir Henry was in great jeopardy. And then, not mentioned by Henry C. Clark is the case of the dancing men.
Well, and of course, this is one where Holmes arrives out at Ridlingthorpe Manor too late. Hilton Cubitt is already dead, and his wife is suffering from a near mortal wound that was self-inflicted after meeting up with Abe Slaney. Now, here's the thing. Less so than the Melas case in The Greek Interpreter, where he had already been abducted. I think there was less certainty involved with dancing men. Now, Holmes, of course, knew he was dealing with a Chicago criminal, so there was the potential there, but it certainly, it wasn't something that was certain, as you could have predicted with someone who had already been threatened and abducted. However, I find that the situation with Hilton Cubitt, to me at least, strikes an even more tragic note than the loss of Paul Cratidas in the Greek interpreter. You know, you had this great love affair between Elsie and Hilton Cubitt, and you know, Hilton came and really pled his case, whereas Paul Cratidas was more like a pawn in a game there before. So it does strike a little more tragic than this earlier mistake on Holmes's part.
Well, it is, and it's another case of where, you know, it just seems the death of Hilton Cubitt seems to have been so preventable and so unnecessary, and could have been prevented, you know, with any number of small actions. And that gets us to the conclusion and to the real interesting subtext here, because the way Henry C. Clarke ends this paper is he says, you know, there may be other cases of this strange shortcoming of Sherlock Holmes, but at least these are respectfully submitted for such comment as may be forthcoming from those far wiser in the qualities of the great man than the writer. And that, I think, is just a lovely way to end it, and an invitation to comment. And my comment is here, you know, what does it tell us about Sherlock Holmes? I mean, it does seem that he has no sense of the fellowship of man, you know, no human feeling. I mean, he's obviously very intellectual. It seems as if fate had not thrown Dr. Watson into his orbit, if he had not been so impecunious, if he had a little more money and could afford to live on his own, what a different life he would have had. You know, you can't imagine Sherlock Holmes putting up a little personal ad that says, you know, wanted flatmate.
Right.
To share cheery lodging with interesting intellectual partner, you know. I mean, so, you know, he as you said earlier, he focuses on problems and not people.
Yeah, and it really makes you wonder how many more victims there would have been, how many other clients in Jeopardy would have ended the same way as Openshaw, Melis et al. But I suppose the good news is that without Watson there as his constant companion, there would have been no one there to document all of these failures either. So the world would have been none the wiser.
That's right. They would have all been swept under Mrs. Hudson's carpet.
And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Well, my dear Miss Hunter, as your mind is already made up, the matter is settled. But if at any time you should find yourself in any doubt or danger...
Danger? What danger do you foresee?
It would cease to be a danger if we could define it. But at any time, day or night, a telegram will bring me down to your help.